Struggling waitress stands up to wealthy customer in public, but when he finds out her secret later on, he launches a vicious campaign to make her life very hard. Jane wiped the sweat from her brow as she balanced a tray of steaming plates, weaving through the crowded restaurant with practiced ease. The din of clinking cutlery and animated conversations filled the air, a constant backdrop to her hectic life. The clamor was overwhelming at times, a chaotic symphony that Jane had long since learned to tune out. She plastered on a smile, delivering the meals to a boisterous group of businessmen who barely acknowledged her presence. Their laughter echoed loudly, a stark contrast to the emptiness she felt inside. It was just another Friday night at the grill, where Jane had worked for the past 3 years, each shift blending into the next with numbing regularity. As she hurried back to the kitchen, Jane caught a glimpse of her reflection in a polished serving tray. The sight made her pause, a brief moment of self-recognition that felt almost surreal. Dark circles rimmed her blue eyes, a testament to the long hours and sleepless nights that had become her norm. Her once vibrant eyes now seemed dull, the sparkle of youth dimmed by the relentless grind of her life. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, a few stray strands escaping to frame her heart-shaped face, which had lost some of its softness over time. She sighed, adjusting her wrinkled uniform, feeling the fabric that had been worn and washed too many times, before grabbing the next order and pushing forward. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity, chefs barking orders and servers rushing in and out like worker bees in a hive. The heat was stifling, the air thick with the aroma of sizzling steaks and frying onions, mingled with the sharper scent of spices. Jane felt a familiar twinge in her lower back, a reminder of the physical toll her job took on her body. The ache was a constant companion now, a dull throb that flared up during busy shifts. She pushed the discomfort aside, focusing on the task at hand, knowing there was no time to dwell on it. There was always another plate to serve, another table to clear, and countless more hours to get through before she could rest. There was no time for self-pity. She had mouths to feed and bills to pay. As she emerged from the kitchen, Jane's eyes darted to the clock on the wall. The hands seemed to move agonizingly slowly, mocking her with their sluggish pace. Only 3 more hours until her shift ended, she told herself, and then it was off to her night class. The thought of sitting in that cramped, fluorescent-lit classroom, struggling to keep her eyes open as the professor droned on, filled her with dread. But she was determined to finish her business degree, no matter how exhausted she felt. The promise she had made to herself and the image of her mother's proud smile kept her going, even on the toughest days when all she wanted was to collapse into bed and forget the world. Jane's mind wandered to her mother as she refilled water glasses at a nearby table, her hands moving automatically while her thoughts drifted. Sarah Thompson had once been a vibrant, energetic woman, full of life and laughter, her presence a comforting constant in Jane's world. But the ravages of her illness had taken their toll, stripping away the vitality that had once defined her. Now she spent most of her days in bed, relying on Jane for everything from medication to companionship. The weight of responsibility sometimes felt crushing, like a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. But Jane wouldn't have it any other way. Her love for her mother was fierce and unwavering, a beacon that guided her through the darkest of times. "Hey, Jane!" called out her co-worker, Lisa, from across the room, breaking through Jane's reverie. "Table 12 needs their check when you get a chance." Jane nodded, grateful for Lisa's help in keeping track of her tables. Lisa was more than just a co-worker. She was a lifeline, a friend who understood the struggles Jane faced. The two had become fast friends over the years, bonding over the challenges of balancing work and personal lives. Lisa knew about Jane's situation and often covered for her when she needed to leave early for her mother's appointments. Their friendship was one of the few bright spots in Jane's life, a source of comfort and support in an otherwise bleak existence. As Jane printed out the check for Table 12, she allowed herself a moment to dream, a rare indulgence in her otherwise pragmatic life. One day, she thought, she'd have her degree and a job that would provide for both her and her mother comfortably. She imagined a life where she could afford to take her mother on trips, to see the places they had only talked about. But for now, she had to focus on the present, on the next table, the next order, the next step towards her goal. With a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and headed back out into the bustling restaurant, ready to face whatever challenges the rest of her shift might bring. The future was still far away, but as long as she kept moving forward, she knew she would get there eventually. The restaurant was alive with the familiar hustle of a busy Friday night. The clink of glasses and the hum of conversation filled the air, creating a lively atmosphere that bordered on chaotic. The restaurant was packed, with every table occupied and a steady stream of customers still filtering in. Suddenly, a hush fell over the restaurant, an almost unnatural silence that rippled through the crowd like a wave. Jane looked up, her curiosity piqued, just in time to see the front doors swing open. In strode a group of impeccably dressed individuals, their presence demanding attention even from the most distracted diners. At the head of the group was a man whose aura exuded power and control. Martin Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, surveyed the room with cold, calculating eyes that missed nothing. His tailored suit, which probably cost more than Jane made in a month, fit him perfectly, the fabric catching the light with every movement. A platinum watch gleamed on his wrist, a subtle yet unmistakable display of wealth. "Mr. Blackwood, welcome to the grill," the maitre d' gushed, practically tripping over his own feet in his eagerness to greet the notorious businessman. The normally unflappable maitre d' was reduced to near fawning as he gestured towards the best table in the house. "We have your usual table ready for you and your guests." Martin merely nodded, barely acknowledging the man's existence as he strode purposefully through the restaurant. His entourage trailed behind him like well-trained puppies, their expressions a mix of awe and subservience. Jane watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease, her instincts telling her that this was not going to be a typical night. As the group settled into the prime table in her section, Jane felt a knot form in her stomach. She had heard stories about Martin Blackwood, and none of them had been flattering. His reputation for being demanding, rude, and stingy with tips was well known among the staff. The thought of serving him made her palms sweat, but she knew she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed down her apron, trying to steady her nerves. She approached the table with a practiced smile, her voice as calm and professional as she could manage. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Welcome to the grill. Can I start you off with some drinks?" Martin's piercing gaze swept over her, his eyes cold and unfeeling. His expression was a mixture of boredom and disdain, as if he were already disappointed with the service before it had even begun. "Bring us a bottle of your finest red," he ordered, his tone clipped and impatient. He didn't bother to look at the wine list, clearly uninterested in the details. "And make it snappy. We don't have all night." Jane nodded, biting back the retort that danced on the tip of her tongue. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but there was something about Martin that set her on edge. His arrogance was palpable, a tangible force that seemed to suck the air out of the room. As she turned to leave, she overheard one of Martin's companions chuckling. His voice was low, but not low enough to escape her ears. "Another nameless face in an apron," he said, the words dripping with condescension. "I swear they all look the same after a while." Jane's cheeks burned with humiliation, the sting of his words hitting harder than she expected, but she kept her head high as she walked away, determined not to let them see how much they had affected her. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to be reduced to nothing more than an object of ridicule by a group of entitled businessmen. In the relative safety of the service station, Jane took a moment to collect herself. The familiar surroundings brought a small measure of comfort, though she could still feel the weight of Martin's gaze on her back. She could almost hear their judgmental whispers, their eyes tracking her every move as if waiting for her to make a mistake. "Don't let them get to you," she muttered to herself, forcing her hands to stop trembling as she selected a bottle of the restaurant's most expensive wine. The label was a deep crimson, the bottle heavy and cool to the touch, a stark contrast to the heat rising in her chest. "Just get through this shift, and you'll be one step closer to never having to deal with people like that again." With renewed determination, she squared her shoulders and headed back to the table. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She had no way of knowing that her interaction with Martin Blackwood was about to take a turn she could never have anticipated. The encounter would soon prove to be far more complicated and consequential than just a difficult customer demanding attention. Jane braced herself for the night ahead, unaware of how much this seemingly ordinary shift was about to change the course of her life. Jane approached Martin's table, her hands steady despite the tension coursing through her. She could feel the weight of the evening pressing down on her, but she had learned to mask her emotions with a professional demeanor. As she presented the wine bottle, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "An excellent choice, sir," she said, her voice calm and courteous, even though her stomach churned with unease. Martin barely glanced at her as she poured, his eyes focused elsewhere, his attention seemingly absorbed in regaling his companions with tales of his latest business conquest. The conversation was full of boastful remarks, each story more self-aggrandizing than the last. As the evening wore on, Jane found herself returning to the table with increasing frequency. Martin's demands seemed to grow more ridiculous with each visit, his request becoming a test of her patience. "Girl," he barked at one point, snapping his fingers as if she were a dog to be commanded. "This steak is overcooked. Bring me another." The disdain in his voice was palpable, each word dripping with contempt. Jane bit her tongue, suppressing the retort that threatened to escape. Instead, she nodded politely, her face a mask of professionalism, as she whisked away the barely touched meal. The effort to remain composed was exhausting, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose her temper. Around the restaurant, other patrons began to take notice of the scene unfolding at Martin's table. Sympathetic glances were cast in Jane's direction, their conversations hushed as they witnessed Martin's boorish behavior. The discomfort was palpable, a tension in the air that made the once lively atmosphere feel heavy and oppressive. Lisa caught Jane's eye from across the room, concern etched on her face. She mouthed a silent, "You okay?" offering a small lifeline of support. Jane managed a tight smile in response, nodding slightly, though she was far from okay. Determined not to let Martin see how much he was affecting her, she straightened her posture and forced herself to focus on her task. "I swear," Martin loudly proclaimed to his friends, his voice carrying across the restaurant with the arrogance of a man who believed himself above reproach. "The service in this place gets worse every time I come here. You'd think they'd hire people who actually know how to do their jobs." His companions chuckled, sycophantically, their laughter hollow and nervous. Their eyes darted around the room, as if searching for a way to distance themselves from the escalating tension. Jane felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her, the heat rising to her cheeks as she approached the table once more. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, their pity almost as unbearable as Martin's insults. Martin held up his empty glass as she neared, shaking it impatiently in her direction. "Another drink," he demanded, not even bothering to look at her. It was the third time in 10 minutes he had made the same request, each time barely sipping the fresh drink before demanding a replacement. The sheer pettiness of his behavior was infuriating, but Jane knew she couldn't afford to react. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself against the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Her voice was firm but polite as she responded, "I apologize, sir, but I need to attend to my other customers. I'll be back to check on you shortly." The table fell silent, Martin's friends shifting uncomfortably in their seats. their discomfort at the situation evident. Martin's face contorted with rage, his eyes narrowing into a menacing glare as he fixed his gaze on Jane. The sudden shift in his demeanor was startling, the cold indifference replaced by a seething anger that seemed to radiate from him in waves. Before Jane could react, Martin's arm shot out, and in a flash he hurled his glass directly at her. The motion was so sudden that she barely had time to flinch. The glass struck her side, the remaining ice and liquid splashing across her uniform, soaking through the fabric. The glass clattered to the floor, the sound ringing out sharply in the now deathly silent restaurant. All eyes were fixed on the unfolding scene, the diners frozen in shock at what had just transpired. Martin stood slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, the grating sound echoing through the room. He loomed over Jane, his presence imposing and threatening. "How dare you?" he snarled, his voice low and venomous. His eyes bore into hers, filled with a mixture of fury and contempt. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the implication that he believed himself untouchable, above reproach and beyond the rules that governed everyone else. Jane stood frozen, the icy liquid seeping through her uniform, chilling her skin. But the fire that had been smoldering inside her since the start of the evening now blazed into an inferno. The rage she had held back, the indignity she had swallowed, all surged to the surface. Yet even in the face of Martin's looming threat, she remained outwardly composed, her hands no longer shaking. This moment, she realized, was about more than just a rude customer. It was about standing up for her dignity, for the respect that every human being deserved, regardless of their position or status. The icy liquid seeped through Jane's uniform, chilling her skin and sending a shiver down her spine. But the fire in her eyes burned hot, a stark contrast to the cold dampness spreading across her clothes. She stood motionless for a moment, her senses heightened as the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. She could feel every gaze on her, a collective tension that thickened the air, making it almost difficult to breathe. The silence that followed the crash of the glass was deafening, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic drip of alcohol from her sodden apron onto the polished floor. It was a silence filled with anticipation, as if the entire room was waiting for the inevitable confrontation that was about to unfold. Jane took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs as she forced herself to remain calm. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin slightly as she met Martin's furious gaze head-on. There was no fear in her eyes, only a steely resolve that surprised even her. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm and clear, carrying easily across the hushed dining room. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand you're upset," she began, her tone measured and professional. "But your behavior is completely unacceptable. No one, regardless of their position or wealth, has the right to treat another human being this way." Her words hung in the air, firm and unyielding, a challenge to the power dynamics that Martin had so carelessly abused. Martin's face contorted with rage, his eyes bulging as his complexion turned an alarming shade of purple. His lips twisted into a sneer, and he struggled to find the words to express his fury. "How dare you speak to me like that?" he spluttered, his voice rising in pitch as his anger boiled over. Spittle flew from his lips as he jabbed a finger in Jane's direction, his entire body trembling with indignation. "I'll have your job for this, you insolent little—" But before he could finish his sentence, Jane cut him off, her voice unwavering and filled with quiet strength. "Sir," she said, her tone firm but devoid of malice, "I'm simply doing my job to the best of my ability. Your status doesn't give you the right to demean or assault me or anyone else. We all deserve to be treated with basic respect and dignity." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that silenced even the most cynical onlookers. A murmur of agreement rippled through the restaurant, the other patrons finally finding their voices as they quietly expressed their support. Jane felt a surge of strength from the silent solidarity of those around her, their collective disapproval of Martin's behavior a palpable force. Martin opened his mouth to retort, his fists clenching at his sides as he prepared to unleash another tirade. But before he could speak, he was interrupted by the arrival of the restaurant manager, Mr. Davis. The older man, usually genial and quick to smile, now wore a grim expression as he surveyed the scene with a critical eye. "Mr. Blackwood," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument, "I'm going to have to ask you and your party to leave. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior towards our staff or other customers." There was an authority in his tone that made it clear there would be no exceptions, not even for someone as powerful as Martin Blackwood. For a moment, it seemed as though Martin might argue, his fists still clenched in defiance. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for some form of support or a way to turn the situation to his advantage. But as he took in the cold stares and disapproving murmurs of the other patrons, he seemed to realize the futility of his position. With a huff of frustration, he grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, his movements jerky and aggressive. As he shrugged it on, he fixed Jane with a look of pure venom, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "This isn't over," he hissed, leaning in close enough that Jane could feel the heat of his breath. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I'll make sure you regret this. Mark my words." As Martin and his entourage were escorted out, a smattering of applause broke out in the restaurant, the sound hesitant at first but growing stronger as more people joined in. The applause wasn't just for Jane, but for the stand she had taken against someone who had abused his power. It was a moment of collective catharsis, a way for the other patrons to express their own frustrations with the injustices they had witnessed. Jane felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Lisa standing beside her, concern etched deeply into her features. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked softly, her voice laced with worry. Jane nodded, the adrenaline from the confrontation beginning to fade, leaving her feeling shaky and drained. She looked down at her stained uniform, suddenly aware of the chill seeping into her bones from the damp fabric. The night was far from over, and despite the support she had received, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that Martin's threats were more than just empty words. The venom in his voice, the intensity of his gaze, it all suggested a man who was used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. Jane knew she had stood up for herself, but as she watched the door swing shut behind Martin, she couldn't help but wonder what repercussions might follow. The warmth of Lisa's hand on her shoulder was a small comfort, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed large in her mind. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Jane's phone began buzzing incessantly, yanking her from the restless sleep that had done little to restore her energy. Her dreams had been plagued by the events of the previous night, and the sudden onslaught of notifications jolted her into full wakefulness. Groggily, she reached for the device, her eyes squinting against the harsh light of the screen. As she scrolled through the barrage of messages and alerts, her heart began to race. The headlines blared at her, their bold letters practically screaming, "Local waitress exposed, a history of theft?" A cold wave of panic rose in her throat, tightening her chest as she clicked on one of the articles, her hands trembling with dread. The words on the screen seemed to blur before her eyes, the memories of that painful time rushing back with brutal clarity. 2 years ago, she had been working at a small boutique, struggling to make ends meet while caring for her ailing mother. The accusations had come out of nowhere, sudden, baseless, and devastating. Jane had been accused of stealing expensive jewelry, a crime she had never committed. Despite her fervent protests and the glaring lack of evidence, the owner had fired her on the spot, leaving her reputation in tatters. She had been forced to move on, to bury the shame and keep going. But now, the very things she had fought to leave behind had resurfaced in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. As Jane dressed for her shift at the grill, her mind raced with 1,000 questions. How had this information come to light after so long? Who could have possibly dug up this old, painful chapter of her life? She had been so careful, so determined to move forward and never look back. Then, like a punch to the gut, the realization struck her. Martin Blackwood, the parting threat he had hissed at her as he was escorted out of the restaurant, replayed in her mind, each word dripping with malice. The pieces fell into place, and Jane felt a wave of anger and helplessness wash over her, mingling with the remnants of fear. The realization that he had the power and resources to dig up her past, and had done so to destroy her, left her feeling violated and exposed. The normally bustling street outside her apartment building seemed eerily quiet as Jane made her way to work, her thoughts heavy with dread. The early morning light cast long shadows on the pavement, and she couldn't shake the feeling that those shadows were following her, creeping closer with every step. She could feel eyes on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down, making her feel small and vulnerable. Neighbors she had known for years seemed to retreat behind their curtains, their whispers barely audible but still cutting. A passing car slowed as it approached, the driver craning his neck to get a better look at her. Jane quickened her pace, her cheeks flushing with a mix of shame and indignation. How quickly people turned, she thought bitterly. How eager they were to believe the worst. Approaching the grill, Jane's stomach churned at the sight of the nearly empty parking lot. The once comforting familiarity of the restaurant now felt alien, as if it had transformed into a place of judgment overnight. A few regular customers lingered outside, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion as they watched her approach. Among them was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who usually greeted Jane with a warm smile and a kind word. Today, however, she clutched her purse tightly against her body, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Without a word, Mrs. Henderson hurried inside, leaving Jane standing there, feeling more alone than ever. Inside, the restaurant was a far cry from its usual lively atmosphere. The energy that typically buzzed through the grill had been replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. A handful of patrons sat scattered throughout the dining room, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting towards Jane as she made her way to the back. Every glance felt like an accusation, every whisper a condemnation. The kitchen, usually a chaotic whirlwind of activity, was strangely subdued. Her co-workers, who had become something of a second family to her, fell silent as she entered, their expressions a mixture of pity and unease. The camaraderie that had always made the long hours bearable was now tainted by the scandal that had erupted around her. Before she could even clock in, Mr. Davis intercepted her, his usually jovial face creased with concern. The warmth that typically radiated from him was gone, replaced by a stern, almost fatherly worry. "Jane," he began, his voice low and serious, the gravity of the situation clear in his tone. "We need to talk about this situation." He gestured towards his office, the place where so many routine conversations had taken place. But today it felt like a tribunal. Jane followed him, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs feeling like they might give out beneath her at any moment. As she sat across from him, the small, familiar office suddenly felt oppressive, the walls closing in. Jane couldn't help but wonder if this was the end of everything she had worked so hard to build. The weight of Martin's revenge pressed down on her, threatening to crush the life she had so carefully constructed, leaving her future hanging by a thread. Jane sat across from Mr. Davis, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. The familiar fabric felt foreign in her hands, a stark reminder of how much had changed in the span of a single morning. The silence in the office was thick with tension, each second that passed amplifying the weight of the situation. Jane could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the rhythm erratic and unsettling. Finally, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet Mr. Davis's gaze. Her voice, though steady, carried the undercurrent of fear she was struggling to suppress. "Mr. Davis, I know how this looks," she began, the words coming out in a rush. "But I swear to you, I was innocent then, and I'm innocent now. I've never stolen anything in my life." Mr. Davis leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed as he considered her words. The usually warm and fatherly demeanor he exuded was now tinged with concern and contemplation. Jane watched as he tapped his fingers against the armrest, a habit she had noticed in him when he was deep in thought. "I believe you, Jane," he said after a long pause, his tone reassuring but laced with the gravity of the situation. "You've been nothing but honest and hard-working since you started here." His words offered a sliver of comfort, but Jane knew they were only the beginning. "But we need to address this situation before it gets worse." He paused again, the silence between them heavy with unspoken worries. Finally, he added, "What do you think we should do?" Jane's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, anger, and determination. She thought of her mother, lying in bed, relying on Jane's income and support. She thought of her dreams of finishing her business degree, of the future she had been working so hard to build. The image of Martin Blackwood's sneering face flashed in her mind, and she felt a surge of defiance. She couldn't let his vindictiveness destroy everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed for. Her voice, though soft, carried a new edge of resolve as she answered. "I want to tell my side of the story," she said, her determination growing with each word. "To everyone, the staff, the customers, anyone who will listen." Mr. Davis nodded slowly, a small, approving smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He seemed relieved by her resolve, as if her decision had confirmed something he already suspected. "I think that's a good idea," he said, the warmth returning to his voice. "We'll call a staff meeting right away, and then we can figure out how to reach out to our regulars." He stood up, gesturing for Jane to follow him. As they walked out of the office, Jane felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile but growing sense that she might be able to reclaim control of her life. She wasn't going to let this define her, wasn't going to let Martin Blackwood's cruelty be the final word in her story. The staff gathered in the dining room, their faces a mix of curiosity, concern, and quiet support. Jane stood before them, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared to speak. The weight of their attention was daunting, but she knew she had to find the strength to tell her truth. "I know you've all heard the rumors," she started, her voice wavering at first but gaining strength with each word. "But I want you to hear the truth from me." She took a deep breath and plunged into the painful memories, recounting the false accusation that had nearly destroyed her 2 years ago, the lack of evidence that had done nothing to protect her, and the enduring pain of being judged without a fair chance. As she spoke, she could see the expressions of her colleagues soften, their concern turning into understanding. By the time she finished, Jane felt emotionally drained, but she also felt a sense of release. The weight of her story was no longer hers alone to bear. Lisa, her friend and fellow waitress, stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've got your back, Jane," she said firmly, her voice filled with unwavering loyalty. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, the solidarity of her co-workers wrapping around her like a comforting blanket. Jane felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by their support and the realization that she wasn't alone in this fight. The bonds they had formed over years of working together were stronger than the lies and slander that had been thrown her way. Mr. Davis cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "All right, team," he began, his voice authoritative yet gentle. "We're going to stand by Jane. If any customers have questions or concerns, direct them to me or to Jane if she's comfortable." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, making sure everyone understood the gravity of his words. "We're a family here, and we look out for our own." The staff dispersed, many pausing to offer Jane words of encouragement or a supportive pat on the back. As the first customers of the day began to trickle in, Jane straightened her apron, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready to face whatever came her way, knowing that she had the strength of her convictions and the support of her work family behind her. The grill buzzed with activity, a stark contrast to the eerie quiet of the past few days. Regulars trickled in, their familiar faces a welcome sight to Jane as she navigated the dining room. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had avoided her earlier, approached with a sheepish smile. "Jane, dear," she said, patting her hand, "I'm sorry I doubted you. You've always been such a sweet girl." Jane's phone pinged incessantly, notifications flooding her screen. She glanced down during a lull in her shift, her eyes widening at the outpouring of support on social media. Stand with Jane was trending locally, with hundreds of messages from community members sharing their own stories of false accusations and resilience. Lisa rushed over, her face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you won't believe this. The local news wants to do a story on you. They're calling you a symbol of standing up against corporate bullying." Jane felt a mix of emotions, pride, nervousness, and a glimmer of hope that her story might help others in similar situations. Outside the grill, a small crowd had gathered. Jane peered through the window to see people holding handmade signs with messages like, "We believe Jane," and "Honesty prevails." Among them, she recognized faces from her night classes, neighbors, and even some of her mother's doctors. The sight brought tears to her eyes. Mr. Davis approached, a wide grin on his face. "Jane, you're not going to believe this. Some local business owners have started a fundraiser for your mother's medical expenses. It's already raised over $5,000. Jane's hand flew to her mouth, overwhelmed by the generosity of her community. The weight she'd been carrying for so long began to lift. As her shift ended, Jane stepped outside to thank the supporters. A young woman broke from the crowd, introducing herself as Emily from the local community center. "We're starting a petition to formally clear your name," Emily explained eagerly, "and we're organizing a town hall meeting to discuss how we can prevent similar situations in the future." Jane listened, her heart swelling with gratitude and a newfound sense of purpose. As she looked at the faces around her, some familiar, some strangers, she realized that this ordeal had given her something unexpected, a platform to make a difference. The challenges weren't over, but for the first time in days, Jane felt a surge of optimism. She took a deep breath, ready to share her story and inspire others to stand up for what's right. Martin Blackwood paced his luxurious corner office, the skyline of the city sprawling out before him. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie loose and hair unkempt. The constant ping of his phone, once a sign of his importance, now filled him with dread. Each notification brought more bad news, more fallout from his vendetta against Jane. "Sir," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Stevenson from Apex Corporation is on line 1. He wants to discuss terminating their contract." Martin's fist slammed down on his mahogany desk, rattling the expensive trinkets that adorned it. This was the third major client to pull out in as many days. He grabbed the remote, unmuting the large flat screen on the wall. The local news was running yet another story about Jane, praising her resilience and integrity. The anchor's voice grated on Martin's nerves. In a stunning turn of events, the community has rallied behind Jane Thompson, the waitress wrongfully accused of theft by business tycoon Martin Blackwood. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Martin's CFO, Alan, entered without waiting for a response. His face was grim as he tossed a stack of papers onto the desk. "It's bad, Martin. Our stock has dropped 30% since this morning. The board is calling for an emergency meeting." Alan's eyes, usually deferential, now held a hint of accusation. Martin slumped into his leather chair, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. His phone buzzed again, a text from his wife. "The country club called. They're revoking our membership. What have you done, Martin?" He stared at the message, a hollow feeling growing in his chest. His carefully cultivated world of privilege was crumbling around him. Outside his office, he could hear the hushed whispers of his employees. Once they had scurried out of his way, eager to please. Now their voices held a different tone, one of judgment and disappointment. Martin realized with a sinking feeling that he had become a pariah in his own company. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his once imposing office. Martin stood at the window. He watched the bustling city below, people going about their lives, oblivious to his downfall. For the first time in years, he felt truly alone. The power he had wielded so carelessly, the influence he had taken for granted, was slipping through his fingers like sand. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds of Mr. Davis's office, casting long shadows across the room. Jane sat nervously, fidgeting with the hem of her uniform as she waited. The unexpected call from her former employer had left her feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. The door creaked open, and Mr. Davis entered, followed by a well-dressed woman Jane didn't recognize. "Jane, this is Ms. Thompson from Stellar Boutique," Mr. Davis introduced. The woman extended her hand, a look of genuine remorse on her face. "Ms. Thompson, I can't express how sorry we are for what happened," she began, her voice soft but firm. "We've recently uncovered some disturbing information about the circumstances surrounding your dismissal." Jane leaned forward, her heart racing as she listened to Ms. Thompson's explanation. As the story unfolded, Jane's eyes widened in disbelief. The theft she'd been accused of had been part of a larger scheme, a hostile takeover attempt by none other than Martin Blackwood. He had planted the stolen jewelry, hoping to discredit the boutique's management and drive down its value. "We found emails," Ms. Thompson continued, pulling out a folder. "Correspondence between Mr. Blackwood and one of our former managers. They detail the entire plan, including using you as a scapegoat." Jane's hands shook as she looked at the evidence, years of pain and doubt suddenly given context. Mr. Davis let out a low whistle. "This is bigger than we thought, Jane. It's not just about what happened at the grill. This man has been manipulating people's lives for years." He shook his head, disgust evident in his voice. Ms. Thompson cleared her throat, drawing Jane's attention back. "We want to make this right, Ms. Thompson. We're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement, and we'll do everything in our power to clear your name publicly." Jane nodded, tears welling in her eyes as the weight of vindication washed over her. The grill was alive with celebration, colorful streamers and balloons adding a festive touch to every corner. Jane found herself at the heart of the excitement, her face glowing with a blend of pride and bashfulness. Mr. Davis raised his glass, his booming voice cutting through the chatter. "To our new assistant manager, Jane Thompson." The crowd erupted in cheers, glasses clinking in celebration. As the party continued around her, Jane found a quiet moment to reflect. She glanced at the framed acceptance letter from State University, proudly displayed near the bar. The full scholarship felt like a dream come true, a chance to finally complete her business degree without the constant worry of finances. Across town, in a stark contrast to the joyous atmosphere of the grill, Martin Blackwood sat in his lawyer's office. The once imposing businessman seemed smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched as he listened to the litany of charges being brought against him. Corporate espionage, defamation, harassment. "Mr. Blackwood, I won't sugarcoat it. You're facing serious jail time." Back at the party, Lisa pulled Jane aside, her eyes shining with excitement. "Jane, you won't believe this. Remember that women's shelter we volunteered at last month? They want you to speak at their fundraiser next week. You're like a local celebrity now." Jane laughed, still unused to the attention her story had garnered. As the night wound down, Jane stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The cool breeze carried the scent of possibility, of new beginnings. She thought about her mother, now receiving the best medical care thanks to the community's support. She thought about the young girls at the shelter, facing their own battles, and how her story might give them hope. A familiar voice broke through her reverie. "Jane?" She turned to see Emily from the community center, a wide smile on her face. "I just wanted to let you know we've started a mentorship program inspired by you. It's for young women facing adversity in the workplace. Would you consider being our first mentor?" Jane's heart swelled with a mix of pride and humility. As she looked at the twinkling city lights, she realized that her journey had become something bigger than herself. It wasn't just about clearing her name or standing up to one bully. It was about creating a ripple effect of courage and kindness, inspiring others to find their own strength in the face of injustice. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.